perhaps you can introduce yourself and your family, most importantly, and how you got involved in politics, and what is it that got into your system to go back into the political arena and run for the leadership of the party.
Well, that's a great intro. I appreciate it, and I appreciate all that you've done for the Conservative Party. Ray Natishan was a dear friend of my father's, who he served with in Parliament way back then in the 70s and 80s, and up till we left government in 1993. So I grew up in a small town in Nova Scotia. I was working as a Crown prosecutor when I met then leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, Jean Charest, who was attempting to rebuild our party after the corporate downsizing in 1993. And we were in a recovery mode at that time, kind of like now, only we had a big challenge ahead of us then because the Conservative Party had fractured. And you mentioned that I was part of the effort to bring the Conservative movement back together. I was leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, Stephen Harper, the Canadian Alliance, and we were able to help what I would describe as reunite Conservatives across Canada. And lo and behold, we were back in government by 2006. I served with him for almost 10 years and in 3 different cabinet portfolios: Justice, Foreign Affairs, and National Defense for 6 years. I left politics in 2015, Julius, in large part because we had a 3-year-old, my wife was pregnant, and my mother was quite ill, and I had spent 18 years in politics and thought I should go back and practice law, which is exactly what I did. And we now have a 3rd child, so 7, 4, and 2. And that has prepared me somewhat to come back to politics because there's a lot of screaming and yelling. There's always accusations, and I'm cleaning up other people's messes. So it's perhaps good preparation to return to Ottawa these days. And in all seriousness, I left because of my kids, and in some ways I'm coming back because of them. I'm worried about the direction that the country's headed. I'm worried about the scandalous behavior of our government, the unbridled spending, the lack of work ethic that I see developing as a result of some of the government's pernicious policies, our declining respect in the world, our declining participation in defense, our lack of national security investment and national infrastructure, and quite frankly, a government that seems to have lost its way, that is really concerned more with its re-election than addressing the needs of Canadians. And so I see the Conservative Party as the antidote to the direction in which we are headed. I see us as before, as the party that the government, that the Canadians will turn to govern our country. And I see the opportunity with proper policy, good candidates, and clear-eyed vision for the country. I believe we can win in the next federal election. And I've dedicated my life to politics previously. I've been working in the volunteer sector with Wounded Warriors, Special Olympics, child and youth advocacy. But I feel I still have some gas in my tank and a period of my life that I'm willing to dedicate again to public service. So I made the decision along with my wife, and of course in close consult with family and friends, that I would do this for a period of my life.
Thank you. Perhaps what we can start asking, Peter, is the fact that the Conservative Party of Canada is a diverse and distinct tribes of conservatives whose interests often divides and at times undermines unity. And there are obviously certain times in our history, women's history, which we have been fractured. How would you unite the conservative movement in Canada? And most importantly, how are you addressing perhaps your earlier comment prior to the leadership race, where you have identified at least one group of conservatives, not necessarily in its glowing terms, and but something that could be potentially be viewed as very hurtful. So how would you unite the conservative movement? What kind of structure or organizational reform or changes would you introduce to accommodate these varying and competing interests? And what leadership qualities do you bring to unite the conservative movement?
Well, I described how I did it before, and it required a lot of sacrifice and a lot of discussions across the country. I led that effort to unify the parties, and we had a national referendum, in fact. So it begins with respect and consultation. And I want to hit head on your reference to earlier comments, because those have been misconstrued, torqued beyond all recognition, and used, quite frankly, as a cudgel in the leadership contest, and will be again in the future. I said that the way in which the media and the Liberals attached social conservative issues to Andrew Scheer reminded me of an old poem that I read as a child called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where they hung a dead albatross around the captain's neck as a reminder of things that he had done, and he couldn't get rid of the smell for the rest of his life. And so that's what the media and the Liberals did to Scheer. I didn't say he was a stinking albatross. I didn't say social conservatives were a stinking albatross. I didn't say the issue of social conservatives was a stinking albatross. I said that's what the media and the Liberals did to him. So to say that people have lied about that reference is an understatement. It's not something that I said. It was said exactly in the way that I described it. So I have all kinds of room in the Conservative Party that I would lead for social conservatives. I represented a riding that included a portion called the Little Vatican in Antigonish. That includes St. Francis Xavier University. It's a very strong Catholic community. I have over 20 members of Parliament who would identify as social conservatives who are supporting my leadership, including people like Ed Fast, including James Bazan, many other social conservatives who are supporting me. And I also believe very strongly in conscience rights. And if private members' bills or issues related to people's conscience come before Parliament, under my leadership, they will be free to vote their conscience, including Cabinet. Again, this is something that has been misconstrued and quite frankly used as a means by other leadership camps to try to pull votes away.
A couple of things, maybe if I can walk back a little bit. One is regarding conscience rights. It has been reported that if you are to be the Prime Minister and there are certain issues, particularly referring to conscience rights, that you are going to whip the front bench vote and not give them the ability to actually independently vote.
Where was that reported? Because I have never seen the word whip attributed to me ever.
Yeah,
because I never said that word.
Well, I know that you didn't say that word, but that is something that has been referred to you,
yes.
At least by other camps, right?
Of course. So, and as I said, other camps, of course, are always going to say things that will help their camps and harm my campaign. What I said is that I would expect members of the party to respect the position that was taken by the party. We're a very democratic party, as you know, Julius, and we've had ample time to vote and debate and discuss, as we do and as we will, at national and annual general meetings. The most recent being in Halifax, where we took a vote on whether the Conservative Party would reopen the issue of abortion rights. And the majority of the party voted no.
It's one of the things that sometimes really, whenever I hear it, it irritates me, because often we are being the way the media and the others who are participating, at least in the political arena here in Canada, is they would like to divide the Conservative Party, and so
right.
they keep on perpetuating this whole issue of hyphenated conservative, social
right.
conservative, fiscal conservative, libertarian conservative, rule of law conservative, social conservative, all of that. You know, we are at least 4 or 5 different tribes within the conservative movement. How would you transition us away from that so that we can just simply identify ourselves and be completely, at ease with being called as conservatives and not be labeled as, oh, you're a social conservative, or you're a fiscal conservative? So those are some of the things that I think we needed to do a little bit of work. But how would you do that?
Because I will only answer to Canadian conservative. I don't believe in any of those terms, Julius. I think it's exactly what you said. And with respect to previous comments, with respect to hyphenated conservatives, I only talk about being a Canadian conservative. And I talk about there are many shades of blue, but we're all blue. We're all conservative. There are different aspects, issues, regions that come into play, but we're all Canadian Conservatives. And the vast majority of issues and positions we agree on. And those that we disagree on, after we've had rigorous debates and discussions, we come to a consensus. Or we have a vote. We're very democratic. We allow our conservative family to come together and stake out positions. And we agree to those positions. And that's what I was referring to. But I won't whip the cabinet. I'm not going to deny people's conscience rights. I wrote to the Justice Minister standing up for the rights of doctors and medical practitioners not to have to perform certain medical acts, whether it be assisted dying or others. And I have continually tried to avoid being pulled into that trap of getting onto that dangerous ground for conservatives. Other parties can have the discussions, and the media will not pile on. If we open that door, we are going to be, once again, treated to the type of distortion that we know that the media in particular will do, and it scares people. We're the party of rights. We're the party that brought the first Bill of Rights into being. We're the party of Mr. Mulroney, who stood up against apartheid, against the world. We're the party that had made major strides in protecting Canadians and promoting rights. We're not going backwards, we're going forward.
How would you then cast a vision of what is a Canadian Conservative government? What do you think is a Canadian Conservative government?
Well, it's a government that first and foremost respects people's individuality and their rights. It's a government that wants to be fiscally prudent, that wants to ensure that we are taking steps to secure the future for our children and grandchildren and not leaving the country more indebted and more divided than it's been in my lifetime. We're a party that obviously is diverse in its makeup and its membership. We're a big blue tent that invites everybody and anybody in. And it begins with respect, as I said. We want to hear people's points of view. We want to include their thoughts and their beliefs. But we have to find consensus in order to move the country forward. But we're woven into the DNA of our country. The Conservative Party was the party that put Canada together. We're the party that has shepherded the country through difficult times and through prosperous times. And we will again.
Thank you. Now, we need to expand our conservative base in the Greater Toronto area, especially here in the Greater Toronto area, and in many large urban centers in Canada. These urban centers have growing and vibrant new Canadian communities who are naturally conservative, not only in their political inclination, but of their worldview, often shaped by their traditional family values and affinity to their faith communities. What do you need to do to have a sustained and effective outreach to these growing new Canadian communities who are conservatively inclined in their voting preference?
Well, you answered your question. We need to have sustained and continuous contact. We need to go where they gather, where they meet. We have to have a presence in those communities. We have to have candidates like yourself who represent the communities. We need to have people within the team, the core team of the leader's office that is continuously facilitating that type of contact. The good news is that we have new technologies like what we're using tonight that allow us to have that sustained contact. I would say the same for all groups and cultural communities, but also young people. We need to be on university campuses. We need to be able to interact in a way that demonstrates that the Conservative Party is thinking about them, is including them, is listening. And it's not so much always what we say, but how we present ourselves as being inclusive and listening to others.
One of the things that we often discuss in our own Filipino conservative movement is that quite often, many of these political parties would invite us to be part of the political system of the political party, but not many of us, if not any of us, are being invited into the dance. So there is what we would call diversity, but there is the whole issue of inclusion. And so, is there anything within our structure as a Conservative Party of Canada that does not allow inclusion, or at least has become perhaps a barrier in inclusivity. Is there something that you have noticed in there that has not allowed any of the new Canadians to have a real voice within the Conservative Party movement?
None whatsoever that I've ever seen or encountered that bars the entry of the Filipino community or their voice or their perspectives or their positions or running for our party or seeking office. There is no barriers whatsoever. When we talk about a tent, it's open, and it's open to everyone, and we need to just continue to make that tent bigger and push the pegs back further. And that has to be done. There will be groundbreaking individuals who will come forward from various different communities. We are the party that had the first person of color elected to our party. We're the party that had the first Muslim Canadian appointed to the Senate. We're the party who had the first woman of Japanese descent in the cabinet. We are the party that had not one but two female leaders in recent history. And so we are the party that has been breaking down barriers, but we don't do it in a way that's only symbolic or only done for optics. We do it in a way that it's based on merit. And inclusivity is very much representative of how the party thinks and acts. We need to continue to demonstrate that, but not shy away from the argument and not allow others to paint a picture of us that's negative. Not allow the media or the media voices within the Liberal Party in particular to paint that negative picture of Conservatives. We need to push back and correct the record and demonstrate, most importantly, that we are the party of inclusion.
Let's talk about some policies that are near and dear to many new Canadians, and then we'll be reading off some questions in here from the Zoom group chat in here. Perhaps as we ask various questions in here regarding some of these policies, a number of these questions that have been posted are directly connected with these questions. Policies like individual rights and freedom, religious freedom, immigration and integration, institutional barrier regarding foreign credentials and professional accreditation, fiscal responsibility, rule of law. Perhaps you could articulate your position in the area of religious freedom. Is there the ability, or is there a vision to perhaps reinstate the office of religious freedom under the Peter MacKay government?
Absolutely. In fact, I would expand the office's mandate to not just be identifying issues outside of Canada, but also inside Canada. There has been, unfortunately, a rise in extremism and intolerance in some communities, and we need to have that office in place with the status of an ambassador and a budget to match that allows us to push back and identify when religious freedoms are being infringed, when students are being discriminated against, when acts of violence or hatred or racism have been exhibited. We need that office in place, and it's a shame that the current Liberal government took away that position and banned that office. So we would reinstate that immediately. I think we also need to continue to speak up on the world stage about religious freedoms and intolerance in places like China, in places, quite frankly, like the Philippines, where there have been actions taken by the government there. Our government has continuously stood up and spoken out as Conservatives, as we did when we refused to take part in the Commonwealth Games because of atrocities in Sri Lanka. I mentioned apartheid previously. We have to take principled stands with respect to our institutions, with respect to positions at the United Nations, and with respect to pushing back on occasion in very strong ways at the International Criminal Court, using Magnitsky sanctions, which are now available to Canada. So there are many ways in which we can exhibit our leadership with respect to religious freedoms, and that's something that is, again, very much ingrained in the Conservative way.
I'm glad that you have included both in Canada as well as outside of Canada within in calling out or making sure that religious freedoms, in fact, enjoyed by everyone, not just here within our country, but around the world. Gino was made a comment regarding people who are involved in social justice here in North America. They are often, or he often referred to them as social justice warriors of low expectations. So somehow, they are very keen in fighting, religious freedom and social justice within North America or within the borders of North America, but somehow not necessarily keen in calling out China for the treatment of the Uyghurs population and in other parts of the world. So thank you for your stand. Now, regarding immigration and integration, one of the biggest things that we often, and I have been advocating for real change in this whole aspect of integrating those who are credentialed in other countries, making sure that foreign credentials are being recognized in this country. In as much as we would know, the most often or common phrase or common reason that many federal politicians would say to me is that that's a provincial matter, and the provincial government are supposed to be tackling with that issue. Is there something that the federal government can do to address foreign credential recognition?
Well, the federal government can and always will have a leadership role when it comes to issues around employment. While it's not, I would go further than to call it a provincial issue. It's very often a professional issue. Whether it's the Corps of Engineers, whether it's the College of Doctors and Physicians, whether it's local or provincial bar associations, or Red Seal approvals for certain labor. There is a professional exclusion that sometimes occurs in certain professions. The federal government doesn't have the jurisdiction to force certain organizations to open up or to become more inclusive, but there are certain abilities in which the federal government can convene discussions, can allow provinces, of course, to become more engaged in those challenges. Because what I find, and I think to the core of this issue, is we have many new Canadians who are underemployed. They have tremendous skill sets to bring to bear, and we're locking up that ability for them to truly use their professional skills to bring about great benefit to themselves, but to the country as a whole. So, yes, I think the federal government can play a role. They can't mandate it. They can't tell certain professions what to do, but they can certainly raise the issues and have those discussions with provincial counterparts.
Yeah, well, there's a precedent already in doing that. We, at one time in our history, I think immigration is solely a federal jurisdiction. But somehow we have created this provincial nominee program where provinces were allowed to bring in immigrants according to their economic needs. Could there be also perhaps a regulatory framework in which the federal government can have an agreement with provincial government and the professional agencies that within the regulatory framework, this is something that can be facilitated by the federal government in order for immigrants with foreign credentials to have a better outcome, as opposed to, and I take the Uber ride quite often, and quite often I would talk to people who obviously are immigrants, and I would ask them, how long ago did you come over here? What were you doing back home? And majority of them have incredible professional background, and incredible credentials and incredible experiences. So could it be that the federal government can actually devise or craft a regulatory framework that would allow, within obviously agreement coming from both the provincial government as well as all of these professional associations, so that we would be able to somehow facilitate foreign credentials to be recognized in this country? Would that be possible?
Yes, it is possible, and the federal government could certainly do that. You can't guarantee the outcome, but you can certainly facilitate the discussion and try to bring about a consensus and a better way. And it should happen.
I'll give you a good example. This was at the time during SARS outbreak, and I'm pretty sure this is something that is a discussion nowadays. Well, there is perhaps a lack of at that time during the SARS outbreak. They were talking about nurses lacking in our hospitals, and I made a comment to, or at least have a discussion with our former member of parliament here, Bob Deckard, at that time. And I told him, in the Filipino community, majority of the live-in caregiver programs, not majority, but maybe about 25 to 30% of live-in caregiver programs were in fact registered nurses from back home. Not many of them would have a pathway towards becoming a registered nurse here in Canada. And that has somehow have not been addressed yet. These people are already here, and somehow it behooves us, those who are in federal government that do handle immigration, to be able to craft a regulatory framework that would allow provincial government as well as all the professional agencies or association to be able to have a pathway or craft a pathway similar to the provincial nominee program, where you are allowing certain groups of people or certain people with incredible skills or trades or credentials to come into the province and hand select them. Perhaps there is something like that could be done. I don't know. Maybe I'm dreaming. And
I agree with you. I don't think that's. I don't think that's dreaming. I think that's realistic, pragmatic, conservative thinking.
Yeah. Anyway, perhaps there are individuals in here that wanted to ask a few questions. Let me just read off some of those that are being posted in the group chat. One that was posted in here is, would you revive the Energy East pipeline or revisit?
Yes. And I would go further. I would describe it as a prosperity corridor that runs across the country that brings Canadian oil. Sorry?
How would that look like? The prosperity corridor. I've heard you speak about that, but yeah. I'm excited about it, and I wanted to know more.
Let me describe it for you. It's a corridor that not only moves energy pipelines, but it moves hydroelectricity. It moves all goods and services tax-free. It moves water. It moves communications across all interprovincial boundaries without any tax or without any ability to hinder that movement. And so it's like the railway. It's a unifying nation-building project. It's a concept whose time has come. It's something that would deal with alienation in the West. It would unite Canadians more in ways that we haven't seen in many, many years. Quebec would obviously have to participate, and this would be done in a way that would allow us to contribute so much more to the fight against greenhouse gas. Because if we export liquefied natural gas to the world, to places like India, Pakistan, parts of the Asia-Pacific, parts of Europe, we're reducing greenhouse gas by replacing coal. And we're getting paid to do it. And we're reinvesting money in our own infrastructure, our own new green technologies. We can partner with our First Nations in building this infrastructure, in promoting this corridor. And it's an issue that I believe encapsulates some of what is holding our economy back. Those interprovincial trade barriers alone cost Canadians over $6 billion annually. And we can remove them by negotiating with the provinces to make this a reality.
Now, obviously there are barriers, and you know those barriers. There are environmental groups that are quite determined to not make this happen. How would you navigate that?
Well, they're doing things like blockading our national railway. If they try to blockade a pipeline, we have them removed. There are laws in this country. There are laws in this country that prevent interference with job sites, that prevent public mischief. Putting debris on a track is no different than putting a spike belt on the Trans-Canada Highway or running a chain across a runway. It is prohibited by law to do so.
Would you have the courage to actually send out our law enforcement to be able to arrest those people at the instance of them making this mischief? It's not
for the Prime Minister to send out the national police. It's to send the clear signal that that is expected. The police are expected to do their job. The opposite signal was sent from Ottawa this time. In fact, the Prime Minister was out of the country when the blockades began. He was pursuing his vanity project at the United Nations Security Council, which he lost. But it took him 10 days to utter a word with respect to his expectation of what the police should do. So yes, there should be a clear signal comes from the top.
That's good. We need courage, Peter. We really need courage from the top to be able to do that, because otherwise, I came here 35 years ago because I could not see a future in the country where I came from. Now I'm seeing in my children, and I'm looking at them and I say, is there a future for them here in Canada? We need to have courageous leadership who would actually address this whole, and I call them, environmental terrorists, because they are terrorizing really the economy of Canada. And if we don't have courageous leadership on the top who would actually take this head on, our economy will just continue to tank and will not have a good future for our children and everybody's children's children.
We cannot tolerate lawlessness. I'm a former Crown attorney, and the rule of law has to apply to everyone. There can be no exceptions, and that includes the Prime Minister himself. If you're in a conflict of interest or you're breaking the law, you're held to account. And that's a whole other subject matter. But yes, the rule of law has to prevail.
Carbon tax. What will you do with the carbon tax?
Get rid of it, day one.
Oh, great. That answers your question here, Joey.
Carbon taxes are unfair. They don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They only make Canada's economy less competitive. They unfairly hammer our manufacturing sector, and certain sectors more than others, including the oil and gas sector. And of course, we have a lot of rural Canadians that can't take the subway to work. They don't have transportation options, so they are disproportionately.
All right. Hello?
Hi.
Okay. Perhaps, is there anybody in here that would like to ask a question directly to Peter? Joey or Abby, you posted some questions in here. Perhaps you do have a follow-up question.
Yes, please. Tito Julius.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello, Mr. MacKay. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. It's like breaking bread with the Filipino-Canadians being here today.
I'm delighted to do so. I've had a chance throughout this campaign to meet with Filipino-Canadians all over, including in Edmonton and in Winnipeg. I was surprised the size of the population in Manitoba, but I was also at a meeting yesterday here in Ontario that had large numbers of Filipinos who make enormous contributions daily to our country, to our economy, especially during COVID-19, where so many are working in the healthcare.
Well, definitely, I think that the Conservative, it would have been better if the Conservative was in power during the pandemic. And here's my question. The Filipino-Canadians in Alberta comprise 4.3% of all Alberta's total population at 175,000, the biggest immigrant group in Alberta. And the Filipino-Canadians across the nation are the fastest growing segment of Canadian society according to the 2016 census. Many Filipino conservatives on the ground believe that Trudeau's carbon tax has very little to do with the environment, much to do about cash grab and control. According to Simon Fraser, one of the biggest advocates for the carbon tax, he stated that at best it will reduce carbon emissions in Alberta only by 5%. Yet we all know that its impact in Alberta's economy is much greater than that. This directly affects the prospect for good employment among many Filipino Albertans in the oil sector. As a matter of fact, the Paris Accord and Trudeau's carbon tax has a direct effect on the cost of living for all Filipino-Canadians, and for that matter, all Canadians all across Canada. If you become Prime Minister, will you put Canadians' interests first and take Canada out of Trudeau's pandering to global agenda and take us out of the Paris Agreement like our American cousins? As Prime Minister, will you repeal Trudeau's carbon tax for all Canadians?
Yes, I will kill the carbon tax and look for new markets for Canadian oil and gas, which I know will do far more to help reduce global emissions than anything else we could possibly do in Canada. We're 1.4% of global emissions. That's 1.4%. if we're exporting highly ethical, highly regulated, competitively priced Canadian oil and gas into the world market, we're doing a number of things. We're reducing greenhouse gas emissions by replacing coal. We're generating revenue here at home for Canada. We're pushing back on countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Algeria, Venezuela, whose values we don't agree with, and yet we're buying their product and bringing it into Canada. We need to be completely energy independent, and we need to build the necessary pipelines and infrastructure and have the ability to refine Canadian oil and gas products and share it with the world. When we reinvest the return on what we will be paid, we can then look to develop new green technology. We can embrace big projects in this country like the Lower Churchill Falls, which can light up the whole eastern seaboard of the United States with hydroelectric power. We can look at some of the new technologies that include waste to energy, carbon sequestration. We can look to wave technology in addition to the wind and solar power that we're generating. Nuclear power has come a long way. We have capacity there. So we should be striving for net zero, but we should also be looking at what we can do for the world and be paid handsomely to do so.
Will you take us out of the Paris Accord?
We'll have to see when we get there what the benefits would be to stepping out of that accord. Right now, we're not going to meet the targets. That's clear. But what we can do, as I said, is focus on lowering greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, in North America, but globally. That, to me, is far more important than signing on a dotted line and doing